You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, broadcasting from New York City. And today, on this episode, I'd like to take stock of course, the big news out of the Asia-Pacific region, which is the inaugural Quad Leaders Summit. This was a virtual summit that took place on March 12th, a highly anticipated development. But of course, this didn't really come out of nowhere, right? This is a development that has really been in the works for 14 years, and possibly even longer if you wanted to go all the way back to the Indian Ocean tsunami in December 2004. After which the four countries, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, came together to participate in the disaster relief effort. But joining me today to help make sense of the significance of the summit in the current moment and sort of to reflect a little bit on the background of how we got here is Akriti Vasudeva, a research analyst with the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. Akriti, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Ankit. It's a pleasure.
Terrific. So let's begin by talking a little bit first about the path to this summit meeting itself. So, I talked a little bit about the older background in the early 2000s, which is important, but I think, we can trace the current iteration of the Quad back to around November 2017 when we had that first working level meeting in Manila on the sidelines of the ASEAN Summitry that year. Can you walk us through a little bit about through the process of what the Quad has been up to since then and what exactly happened that led to the conditions coming into place for this summit in March 2021, where we are today?
Thanks, Ankit. So I think on the history of the Quad, and particularly starting around November 2017, what immediately preceded that, as we all remember, was the India-China standoff at the Doklam Plateau. And I think from my perspective, India has long recognized China as a long-term strategic threat, but because of the Doklam standoff and some of the preceding incidents on the border at that time, for example, the Daulat Beg Oldi incident in 2013 and then the Chumar incident in 2014 had already alerted India to potentially an increased Chinese threat in terms of more immediate Chinese threat on the border. And add to that, all of the tensions that were happening in the India-China relationship at that point, whether that was about the nuclear suppliers group bid that India was putting in for and China was sort of resisting, or China putting a technical hold on the designation of Masood Azhar as an internationally recognized terrorist at the United Nations. All of that kind of build up led to that was a background in which the Doklam standoff happened. And from the Indian point of view, I think particularly what happened then was a recognition that China was a more of an immediate, short to medium term threat, and that India sort of needed to take actions to ensure that because it has a capability gap with China, that it is strengthening its partnerships with countries in the region that also have concerns about what China is doing. And we've seen it in the preceding the years since then, after the Doklam standoff and then the summit in 2017. Sort of worsening relations between China and other countries in the region. We've seen, particularly in the last year, Chinese economic coercion of Australia. We have seen, tensions in the Senkaku Islands. We've seen what China sort of doing with Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And so I think all that is sort of a background for how these countries are seeing sort of increasing Chinese combativeness in its relations with its regions, whether in terms of territorial integrity or the militarization of the South China Sea, and all that has sort of led these countries to now come to a point where they need a grouping, a coalition like the Quad to essentially address the challenges that China has created in the region, whether it's in terms of prioritizing international law, whether it's in terms of securing a maritime, rules-based order, whether it's in terms of seeking transparency, whether it's in terms of ensuring that countries are not being threatened by China, whether it's in economic terms or territorial terms, and that's sort of the background for the Quad Summit today.
Yeah. So, everything you just said completely, I think, aligns with, my understanding of how we've seen this alignment of threat perception sort of come into play. The India-China angle is certainly, I think, an important part of the Quad story. Especially because the U.S. And Japan and U.S. and Australia are treaty allies in their dyads. India is, of course, the odd one out in many ways in the Quad. So this sort of process of aligning threat perceptions under the Modi government, particularly since 2014, has, I think, been an important part of the story. But, the Quad is also, as you all know, a famously misunderstood sort of grouping in the Indo-Pacific today. It's often called an antecedent to some kind of Asian NATO, including most recently, I believe, by the Chinese foreign minister. It is, of course, not an Asian NATO. It is not an alliance. And I think the joint statement, my appraisal of the joint statement is actually quite positive because I think it helps really send a message to skeptics of the Quad that these four countries are now coming together to offer the region something that is greater than the sum of their parts, right? And so, instead of me explaining what we saw out of the joint statement, do you want to tell us what the main deliverables were from this Quad summit that just happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree with you that I think particularly the big sort of deliverable out of the Quad Summit was the vaccine initiative. This is essentially an initiative where the US and Japan will invest in Indian manufacturing capacity to make about 1 billion COVID vaccines. And then Australia will essentially help with logistics support on making sure that these vaccines are delivered safely and training programs are done in countries like in Southeast Asia or in the Pacific. So that's the big deliverable. And I completely agree with you because I think, the vaccine initiative shows that the Quad can leverage the comparative advantage of each of its members for the greater good, and that the focus is not just on security as narrowly defined as hard security, but also on the health security, human security aspect of it. And in some ways, I do think this is a return of the Quad to its origins, because as you mentioned in the introduction, that the Quad has disaster relief beginnings, and it was about jointly dealing with regional crises. So 17 years later, we're sort of seeing a return of the Quad to providing public goods in the region. And I think this is also very significant, like I said, from the point of view of countries in Southeast Asia and to an extent in the Pacific who viewed the Quad as merely rhetoric, and now this is really offering a concrete solution. So that was sort of the big concrete takeaway from the summit. But we have also seen that there are, in addition to the vaccine manufacturing working group, there are two other working groups. One is on climate change, and the other one is on critical and emerging technologies. And I think that the latter one, the critical and emerging technologies, is really interesting because here what the Quad is talking about is essentially working together on setting standards for certain emerging technologies in the cyberspace, particularly because of the concerns that these countries have about Chinese innovation or sort of Chinese dominance in technology like 5G and information sharing or intelligence, artificial intelligence. I'm sorry. And so what this means is that what these countries are essentially trying to do now is work together to ensure that China is not able to be really dominant in some of these sectors, because it impacts these countries' abilities um, to get access to these critical materials, and ensuring that there is, this is sort of a common challenge that they're facing together.
Right, right. I mean, just to reiterate, I mean, in terms of interrogating my own blind spots, I mean, if last year in January, a time traveler had told me what would happen with the coronavirus pandemic and then said that there would be a Quad leader summit in March 2021 where, the four countries would announce this sort of piecemeal division of labor on distributing vaccines in Asia, I'd have been frankly blown away, right? So I mean, I think speaks to, first of all, the staff work that went in behind the scenes to sort of realizing this kind of a summit. I think it shows, first of all, a sensitivity to, I think, the discourse in the region, and you're absolutely right to focus on Southeast Asia, where there's been a lot of concern that the Quad is turning into some kind of China-focused containment initiative, and I think this is absolutely the right way to sort of handle that. But I mean, we do see a lot of continuity with the Trump administration in many ways, right? I mean, the first paragraph in the joint statement, titled "The Spirit of the Quad," emphasizes that the four countries bring diverse perspectives and are united in a shared vision for the free and open Indo-Pacific. We strive for a region that is free, open, inclusive, healthy, anchored by democratic values, and unconstrained by coercion. Of course, without naming China, the mention of coercion in itself, I think, clearly indicates the kinds of behaviors that they're concerned about. But also, to focus on the global agenda of this Quad statement, the focus on climate change is, of course, I think, a welcome source of change from the Trump administration, which certainly would never have, I think, agreed to a Quad statement with this idea. We can just look at the G7 statements under the Trump administration for sort of precedent. How do you see the agenda for the Quad developing there when it comes to areas like climate change and other sort of common challenges in the region?
Right. So just one point I wanted to make on the Trump administration and sort of,
Yeah, go
what
for it.
preceded this summit. I do think that there was a lot of conversation in the Trump administration about, vaccine development and about sharing best practices on dealing with COVID-19. This happened in the context of what has been termed as the Quad Plus. This was essentially, a coordination call that was um, initiated by the US at both the Deputy Secretary of State level and the Secretary of State level, and involved countries like New Zealand, South Korea, Vietnam in one iteration, and in other iterations involved Brazil, Israel, and forgetting one other country. But I think I do see some connection between that and how we've seen sort of the pace of cooperation develop, because we've seen in the past 6 months essentially um, the fact that we've had two Quad ministerial level meetings, one working level meeting, and one leader level summit across two different US administrations that have different views on many things. So I do think that there is some sort of continuity there. On future areas of collaboration between the Quad, I think a lot of ideas have been discussed at the expert level in sort of the Quad, right? So there has been a conversation about maritime cooperation, about humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. There was also a tabletop counterterrorism exercise in 2019, and the October 2020 ministerial meeting actually had identified quality infrastructure investment, supply chain resilience. Some of the items that we've seen in this summit have sort of continued from that. From that summit. But I think what is facing the Quad in terms of challenges on working on some of these issues is that one is, you're not going to miraculously agree on everything from now on just because you had a Quad leaders level summit. There is still some gaps in the way that the countries sort of approach certain issues. For example, on the same day as the Quad leaders level summit, we saw that the US, UK, and the EU were among the countries that voted against India and South Africa on a proposal that was to temporarily waive intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines at the WHO. WTO. And the other thing that we need to consider is that there is always complexity in working in the Quad setup. There are 4 countries involved in this, and yes, they have come forward and they do have a common vision and interest in many of these things, but the means of doing that cooperation or the actual practical steps are sometimes very difficult. For example, on infrastructure investment or doing development finance together, all these countries have had large discussions about that in the past. There is an India, Japan, US infrastructure working group. There is a Japan, US, Australia working group, but we've not seen much progress on that. And that's because, these countries are sort of still at different levels on trying to harmonize their procedures and guidelines for working together in a third country. So I think what is significant for me from this summit is that you remember this from so many years of sort of passing through different statements by different countries. We've definitely come to a point where we've seen a very unequivocal commitment to the Quad through this joint statement and through the op-ed that came out in the Washington Post. But I do think that we still have to kind of work on the process of doing things together, what Tanvi Madan has called habits of cooperation. These 4 countries still have some way to go to work on some of those more challenging issues.
Absolutely. The institutionalization, those habits that you referenced are certainly, I think, something that the folks working on this summit were aware of, because they, the final paragraph of the joint statement notes that they will institutionalize a foreign minister level meeting once a year. And to my knowledge, that has happened sort of within the Quad in the bilateral and trilateral setting even, but it hasn't happened at the quadrilateral level yet, although de facto it did, given that we did have 2 foreign minister level meetings beginning in 2019. And
Mhm.
then, of course, later this year, there will be an in-person leaders level summit, which I think will, firstly, I think be a very important photo op because I think, insofar as summits are important because of the photo ops they generate, I think this one fell a little flat because we did end up with pictures of all the
Mhm.
leaders on their various screens around the world, unfortunately. But just looking forward, I mean, if you look at this joint statement and you look at the current moment right now with vaccine diplomacy being sort of a very good way for the Quad to sort of focus on a concrete way to deliver value to the region. What other agenda items that maybe didn't make an appearance here, or at least maybe weren't so prominent in this statement, do you think will be drawn out at future iterations of the Quad, if anything?
Mhm. So I've done some thinking about this, and I think one area that is a sort of a low-hanging fruit, and which has been discussed a lot at the Quad level, is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, because it is a relatively less controversial aspect. It is about providing sort of greater public goods in the region. It is about collective security and shared challenges that we all sort of face together. And something that I think we might see is more work on that, if we can probably have some sort of humanitarian assistance, disaster relief exercise at the multilateral level. Some work that I've done on this in the past has been exploring countries working together on disaster management technology. I think we're going to see a lot more on the supply chain resilience aspect of it, particularly on semiconductors. There were some reports, for example, in the lead up to this Quad summit, that there is some conversation or understanding that's happened at the Quad level on rare earths production, because China is again dominant in rare earths production. And what the Quad is essentially trying to do is make sure that it can reduce its dependence on China and maybe offer a solution with these four countries together. And we know that Australia and India and US and Japan have capacity to do that. So we might see more work in that area. I do think climate change, work on climate change is important to the Biden administration. So we'll probably see more work there, again, in terms of potentially working on climate technology or climate adaptation strategies, or prevention and mitigation strategies as well.
Mm-hmm. So on this podcast, we've been talking a lot about India-China relations for obvious reasons that I hope our listeners are aware of if they've been listening to, any more than one episode in the past few months. But I wanted to sort of ask you an India-specific question here because a common sort of concern that you'll hear in Tokyo, Canberra, Washington when it comes to the Quad is, who is in many ways the weakest link, and the concerns that often come up are regarding India, right? The only non-U.S.
Mhm.
treaty ally in the Quad, and I think if we look at the events of the last year, we obviously have a very interesting sort of shift in threat perceptions, and even the politics of relations with China and India have changed. So, based on your vantage point, I mean, what is India's view right now of the long-term utility of the Quad to basically, I mean, pursue its own interests in the Indo-Pacific, right? I mean, India, Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar has repeatedly said that India is on its own side, which again I think was taken by some Quad skeptics as a sign of somewhat of disinterest. But what's your sense of how India sort of views the Quad fitting into its broader foreign policy these days?
Right. So I think that this summit really was an indication, a continued indication, I would say, of how much India's calculus has changed on China and the Quad in, say, even the last 4 years, right? I think it's really significant that the Quad summit happened on the same day as the meeting of the India-China working mechanism for consultation on the border, and that while the disengagement process is still going on. And my sense is that there has been a realization in Delhi that any concessions that they made to accommodate the Chinese position, whether that was on keeping Australia out of the Malabar exercises, or downplaying the Quad, or having an inclusive vision of the Indo-Pacific, those didn't yield any results on issues that India cared about vis-a-vis China, whether that was resolution of the border, whether that was New Delhi's concerns about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, or the trade imbalance between the two countries. So what seems to be happening now is that what India is also probably noticing that China is already saying that India is in the US camp or it's part of an exclusive bloc like the Quad. And that there's little that New Delhi can do or say to change that Chinese mindset. So why not sort of gain the material and strategic benefits of cooperation with these countries to deal with the future contingency where there might be some sort of conflict situation with China, or at least making sure that India can catch up in terms of its defense capabilities and economic capabilities with China, since there is such a disparity there. So you'll often hear Indian officials talk about India wanting to be a 5 trillion economy. And I think definitely the Quad plays into that, wanting to make sure that India can shore up both its economic and defense capabilities to be able to deal with a future China challenge, but also deliver on its regional and international obligations to countries in the region as sort of an alternative to China.
Absolutely. So, Akriti, before we close out, I did want to give you an opportunity. Is there anything you think we missed with regard to the Quad Summit or the Quad agenda that you'd like to bring up before we close out?
Nothing really. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much, Ankit.
All right, terrific. Yeah, thanks a lot for joining me. This was really great. Again, for listeners, joining me is Akriti Vasudeva at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. So, Akriti, thank you so much, and I'll hope to have you back on to talk about any and all things related to the Quad and geopolitics in this part of the world. For listeners, if you like the show but you haven't yet subscribed, please do so you can catch up with future episodes. And finally, if you've been a listener for a while but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. It really helps get the word out about the show, and we really do appreciate it. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back very soon with more on the Asia Geopolitics podcast.